I'm here with Campfire Audio Solaris IMs. So now I'm ready to go with these. These are, it's a big deal for Ken Ball of Campfire Audio and ALO Audio to make a pair of IMs that were greater than the Andromedas. Now the Andromedas were a huge hit. They were, well, as good as he could make IMs. And so it was, to go exceed that, well, that took a lot of effort. And that's what we have here with these. They use two balanced armatures for the highs, same as the Andromedas. One balanced armature for the mids, again same as the Andromedas. But the bass is now provided by a dynamic driver. So that's the big change. And it's been interesting, ergonomically, I've just left the tips off to make it more apparent. They're quite large and the nozzle goes quite far forward. So the concern was, for example, if you look at the Andromedas, they're quite kind of shallow. And this wasn't always as comfortable. This kind of design wasn't the most comfortable for everyone. Now the Solaris, size-wise, they're not too much different. But depth-wise, well, if we turn them up, look at the difference. It's huge. If I turn them sideways this way, it's really apparent. There's a big gap before you get to the actual body of the IMs. So even people like people with small ears won't have to worry. They should fit fine. And in comparison, you want to have another look. This is really cool. Look at the Vegas instead. The Vegas are absolutely tiny, tiny compared to these. So big difference there. And the funny thing is the Atlas 2. The Atlas 2 are kind of like not around the size of the body of the nozzle section almost. They're pretty tiny. Different ergonomics, obviously, but anyhow, that was pretty funny. But they may be huge. They're not really heavy. They're kind of like Andromeda aluminium weight. But the design is really gorgeous. I mean, we can't miss that. That's fantastic. And so comfort-wise, no issue is going to be there. And they have a wide nozzle, so they fit the same kind of tips as the others do. So with a nice flange there. So that also includes a new cable. This is the new Litz wire SPC cable, and I've got the old one sitting around here too. The old one, you can see the gauge is smaller, so he's upped the gauge of it considerably. So there's the actual wire difference you can see there. And just as reference cable, which I'll talk about for comparison, is kind of thin as well. I removed the memory wire of this one. It just became too annoying to review them, testing stuff on and off. It just ended up kind of snipping the memory wire and carefully removing the plastic around there. Much better without, I reckon. I mean, they stay in fine. Never had any trouble there. And anyway, it's got this nice choker, which slides readily. This plastic bit, and that's fine. Works perfectly. So, ergonomics aside, there's not much to talk about there. It's mainly the sound, which you're all keen to hear about, I'm sure. So sound-wise, well, interesting thing, but the cable makes a difference, I reckon, at this kind of level of IM for sure. Now, Ken was a cable guy, obviously, to start with, so we're very familiar with the fact that he's good with cables. And putting these on the good old Andromedas brought these a step up. But speaking of that kind of sound, if I compared them with the same cable, which was fairly easy, this is a continuation. These have a continuation of the sound of the Andromedas, but with a dynamic driver, the bass is better. And there's some tweaking of the treble and mids as well, so it's even better still. So with the Andromeda, I tended to find them maybe a little bit dark. I tend to use them with this wide bore spiral dot tips, but I mean the bore size doesn't affect all balanced armature IMs so much as it does when there's a dynamic driver involved. So some of what I say will be influenced by tip selection. So for those of you unfamiliar, I'll just go through it again. When you have a dynamic driver, if you have a wider bore tip, now we saw in the unboxing video, if you haven't already checked it out, that there are wider bore tips in the package. You can see the wide bore there. They will reduce the amount of bass from the dynamic driver, so you'll tip the balance towards kind of the treble a bit more. On the other hand, they come with they also come with your standard short foam tips, which are kind of, I suppose, medium bore, and then you have these final Type E tips, which have a narrow bore. And just like in our good old, say, Dita IEMs, or even the good and the Atlas and Vegas, these will bring out the bass better. So I stuck with these, and I'll go into detail why, because I like that bass extension that came out with them. And that's a good place to start, actually. I'm not usually a bass, treble, mids and treble discussion guy, but for the purposes of this review, I reckon it's the way to go. So I reckon, especially with the final, I've got my own pair here. I've got a white pair I use myself rather than the ones here, because these get passed around for review to different people. With the final Type E tips, the bass extension, that means how low it goes and how well it goes down low. Down really, really low into the deep bass, it does excellently. So when you need deep rumble, it gives you deep rumble. So my usual test, if you watch my videos before, is the new Basement tapes. That has some deep rumble. Paul Simon, of all people, has some deep rumble in his music too. All that comes out really, really well. I mean, there's other stuff people test, other genres of music, but it's the same kind of deal, whether it's Massive Attack or some techno or hip hop or whatever, you're still going to get that deep rumble. But it doesn't come out when it's not necessary. And it doesn't have that kind of thicker sound, which sometimes I didn't like out of the Andromedas. It doesn't have that kind of planar, thick sound like you get with Odyssey planers or the LCD2s, which were kind of now too thick sounding for me. It doesn't have that kind of dark sound. And that's where things get interesting around the mids. Now, I thought the mids were a little bit recessed, and another person thought they were very forward. So I thought, what's going on here? And actually having a listen, I think it's the lower mids, maybe upper bass, which is a little bit, takes a step back a bit. So it's not quite so strong. I mean, it's not like the V shape of the kind of the Atlas Vega at all. It doesn't pound and thump when there's not pounding and thumping to be done. But where it does come really forward is in the upper mids. So it really brings out the best out of your vocals and instruments. And, once you get into the treble, I'd say they extend a little bit better than the, and more noticeably than the Andromedas. But it's, of course, I mean, there's nothing to discuss here. It's excellent treble. So, the sound itself, I've talked about, when I talked about the Vegas and when I talked about the Atlas, I used the term coherency. And so, the bass through to the treble was very kind of it was one presentation, and it was there was no seams in between all of them. It was all kind of one thing. So these had a particular V shape. These have that too, so there's no kind of division. But the Solaris are a little bit more interesting. Now, what I reckon they've done is what I'm talking about is not a negative here. They go beyond coherency into a realm where every element in the music, and we're talking not every element where you have good quality recordings, because I listen to a lot of good stuff, comes out as it needs to. So if the bass needs to rumble, it rumbles. If it doesn't, it doesn't. If you need to have, if there are instruments in there, they come really forward. But you still get a sense of space. And I think what this is aiming for is something that I noticed Sony seem to be aiming for with their headphones, and I think IEMs now, for reasons I'll discuss in a minute. So do you remember the Z7 review where I said it sounded kind of discombobulated, where the bass didn't quite meet with the mids, which didn't quite meet with the treble? I don't know if you remember that, but I described it as being like the Mazda RX-8 car, external design. Like it looked like one person had designed the back, and one person had designed the mid section, and one person had designed the front, and it didn't quite all fit. And that kind of, they fixed, sort of was better on the Z1R, but the bass would rumble when it needed to, and the mid-range was kind of forward, but it still had a really great sense of the soundstage. But the treble is where they screwed up. And I get what they were aiming for, because in many ways the Z1Rs did great, and in some ways they didn't. And these seem to be aiming for something similar. And when I was at the Tokyo show, the IEMs that sounded the most like these that I heard were the new Sonys, not the Z1R IEMs, because I didn't get to hear those. But I think it was a 9 in the model name. I'll post it later. It was their top of the line model other than the Z1R, and that sounded very similar to the Solaris. So there's a step beyond. I think what's really exemplifies it, and this is where we get into music, is that there was a review on the Campfire audio site, or a basic paragraph review, where some guy who was involved in music production said, "Oh, they sound like reproducing live music," and for me, that describes the situation really perfectly. They sound, if you listen to anything like, I listen to jazz stuff like, good old Jazz at the Pawn Shop, which I'll talk about in a sec. Even classical or anything like where there's guitars, anything recorded in a standard kind of, it was a live performance, David Chesky binaural or what have you. That sounds really excellent, and that's where these work fantastically. For example, we'll talk about clarity for a moment. Well, I plug these into the AK380. So out of the AK380, they sounded great. I thought I'll start with high-end source, obviously, because they're the flagship IEMs. And I thought, I wonder if I played the same track at the same volume through the Hugo 2, if I'd hear a difference. Because, that's a pretty big deal if you could hear a difference. And there was a step up. And so the detail, you could hear the increased detail from, the step up to the Hugo 2. And that kind of detail is that, for example, I'm just listening to Cannonball Adderley, and he has a track he played in Tokyo from his Very Best of Jazz album, which is this here. And he's blaring away on the trumpet, and you can hear cymbals in the background. There's percussion in the background. And you can hear, despite the trumpet blaring right in your face with this upfront presentation, you could hear the cymbals very, very clearly. They weren't drowned out at all. You could still hear them with perfect clarity. And it made it a really intense experience. And, for example, a Jazz at the Pawn Shop, it's a jazz standard. Actually, in all honesty, I don't really like xylophones in my jazz. I don't really like it as an album generally. But it's one of those albums, like if I'd only ever heard it in the car, I'd think it was crap, and I think, what the hell, why do people like this? I don't know. But actually, if you hear it through these, you hear like the notes and the decay of the notes when they're hit, and all that in glorious detail right up front. And that makes it really fantastic. And this isn't, as I said, something I normally wouldn't like, but when you hear it in that way, you go, now I understand why this is such a fantastic recording. And there's other stuff, like there's Miles Davis, we have David Chesky, just looking at one of my jazz things just to the side here. We have a Manhattan Brass Quintet playing Central Park Morning, which is actually a reproduction of one of David Chesky's older tracks from one of his other albums, and that's really fantastic. We can go on to good old Dave Brubeck Quartet. It is just glorious through these. I have some stuff by a guy called Lee Barker, who's recorded by Costas Metaxas. Now, Metaxas is the guy who designed that crazy skull-shaped headphone amp, and he did some recordings, and I've got some of those, and they're really nice, where there's really nice jazz that was recorded straight through microphones, direct into a tape recorder, nothing, and then just digitized after that. And you get a real sense of space out of those. So, good old, Bill Evans, there's good old Waltz for Debbie, all that kind of stuff. Fantastic, this is just picking jazz, but there are other genres as well. But where did they not work so well, I'm wondering? So, someone commented they didn't like the sound with Fleetwood Mac. Now, granted, there'll be some unit variation, so the sound may not be quite as exactly as I described it, a couple of decibels here or there in the treble. And they didn't like Fleetwood Mac with this. Now, I don't know, someone commented that Fleetwood Mac was good recordings. Well, it's all relative. The recordings I have are way better than the Fleetwood Mac. But Fleetwood Mac comes into the list of what I'd call old style pop, and old style pop tended to not have much bass. And that's where I don't think these do so well. And that's why I think people would prefer, a lot of people who listen to that might prefer the Vegas in some respects. Or, similar kind of IEMs which have, thumping bass, the Atlas. And that, or maybe depending on the tip selection, maybe the Andromedas as well. And these, it's not that I play them badly, it's just that like that thinner sounding pop, with the upper mid forward presentation these have, can make the vocals sound a bit even more thin than they really are. And it doesn't bother me so much because I'm used to listening to Fleetwood Mac as it is. So, but people listen to a lot of old pop that's kind of a thinner sounding to begin with. That may not gel so well with these. So where these exceed is where these are great are with high quality live recordings with a really good source. And of course, that's, you're thinking, yeah, well, but the nice thing is because they all come with this nice cable, you don't have to worry about, you need to buy the usual story, you need to buy the IMs, you need to buy this, you need to buy that. If you've already got good kit, these are going to be great. And it's not to say they didn't drive well out of, say, a FIO M9 or the other stuff I have. The Chord Mojo was fine as well. I have a Calix M, which is now gone, unfortunately. I tried with basically everything. They're fine, but you can really clearly hear the difference between DAPs and maybe even digital filters on some of them where you can switch it. And then in that, I think with this presentation with the stock cable, it can be a bit too lively. I know Campbell has a WM1Z Sony DAP, and they're kind of warm sounding. So I think this combination with a warmer sounding DAP is a little bit better. And I liked it also out of the Continental V5 that even though this is 115 decibel sensitivity, more than the Andromedas, for some strange reason, though it did pick up a fair bit of hiss, it actually worked with the Continental V5 for some reason. It didn't sound like a crazy hiss maniac like the Andromedas do. I don't know why that is, but I can understand why this pairing would work better with a warmer sounding DAP. Now, in that, I put the good old reference 8 on them, and this kind of evens things out, and it kind of evens out that sharp sound a little bit, and it worked really well with the Hugo 2, which is not a warm sounding device, obviously. And this particular combination for me was excellent, and it's actually excellent enough. I'd really like to try it with the M scaler as well. I'd like to see how far I could take these, because while it may not have the treble of something like an Electrostat, the KSE 1200 would be an interesting comparison. The whole presentation for me with high quality live music was fantastic. And that, even though maybe I preferred the slightly warmer presentation of the Type E tips. With the others kind of, it balances still out quite well with the foamies, and maybe a little bit less bass with these if you prefer to have a little bit more treble focus on there. But I found it just really, really excellent for most of the music I listen with, and having it, really in your face. Speakers seem kind of laid back without turning the volume up high. So the presentation of these was really what I'm after. Now, if Ken could put these in a full pair of headphones, I'd love if he could make a Z1R beta, but I don't see it coming anytime soon. But it's all the same. So for me, these are excellent, but with the caveat that they may not work well on some kinds of music, especially stuff which doesn't have already a fair whack of bass in it. That may sound a bit thin. And if there is sibilance in the music, for example, if it's not such a good recording, I found, well, you're going to hear that sibilance. There's just no two ways about it. It's going to be there. You may not like it. So they're not, with some modern stuff, they may not be such a great presentation. And with some modern stuff, something like the Vegas, which are kind of more bass thumping, might be a better go. And, if it's got music that isn't so resolving, as I've always said, unless you can listen to excellent quality music, there's no point in spending huge amounts of money on these things. But speaking of that, $1,500 I think is entirely reasonable. And you think, well, how can a $1,500 pair of IMs be entirely reasonable? Compared to what's out there, there are makers that charge $2,000, more than $2,000, $3,000 for their flagship IMs. And this is Ken's latest, everything he can put into it for $1,500. So in relative terms, I don't think he's price gouging at all. I think, stock you get an excellent setup. But be noted, if you've got only like something cheap, you may not be so blown away by the presentation of these. If you're only listening to, say, regular pop music out of a cheap DAP or a phone, and you plug these in and you think, why don't these blow me away? Well, there's not going to be a surprise there. They really need good music, good live music, and good gear to really appreciate what these are capable of. So just have that in mind, and that's where the value equation comes in. For the people who do have that stuff, who can afford it, they're going to probably really enjoy the Solaris.